Yes, and Jonathan is ready as well. He'll be on the line.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to this GPST webinar on transforming the grid person experiences. My name is Mark O'Malley. I'm the Chief Scientist for the Energy System Integration Group, and the Energy System Integration Group is responsible for Pillar 1 of the Global Power System Transformation Consortium. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. The subtitle for this webinar is Stories from the GPST Consortium, the Global Partnership Solving the Challenges of High Renewable Penetration Grids. I think where this really comes from is the fact that wind and solar are now extraordinarily cheap on an LCOE basis, and a lot of the challenges are now starting to appear or have to do with integrating it onto the grid. I'm not saying the challenges of making wind and solar cheaper have gone away. We still need to do that. But a lot more focus is starting to come onto the grid issues, and that's what the Global Power System Transformation is about. We are targeting this session as a sort of a pre-COP webinar, and we're targeting it to a large extent on the policymakers, although I know a lot of the audience are not policymakers, they're engineers, etc. But the main focus here is on policymakers. Before we start, I just want to recall from my own sort of history or background. 20 years ago, I remember getting into this area and speaking with a policymaker, and he said to me that that climate change would be solved just by policy measures. All we needed was policy measures. And of course, as a young academic researcher in power systems, I was a bit appalled at this, and etc. All I'll say is he's not here and I am. But I don't think what this is about is whether policy is more important than technology or vice versa. That's irrelevant. The relevancy here is that we just have to solve this problem together. So I'll speak a little bit. Next slide, please, Ryan. Just for those who don't know what the Global Power System Transformation Consortium is, I just have one slide here. It was founded around about 2 years ago. In that triangle on the left-hand side, it sort of gives you the sort of makeup of it. At the very top of the triangle are 6 system operators. That'd be ERCOT, AEMO in Australia, National Grid in the UK, Cal ISO, Airgrid Group in Ireland, and EnergyNet from Denmark, of which we have many of those represented on this call today. So those 6 system operators would be recognized to be among the 6 leading system operators in terms of integrating renewables. They came together with the research organizations then bottom left. Notable among them obviously is NREL, Imperial College, Fraunhofer, ESIG, etc. I won't name them all off. And the idea is that those 2 groups together would solve the technical challenges, and then in the bottom right-hand corner, representing sort of developing countries and other system operators, is we would take that information and knowledge and share it with the rest of the world to help them decarbonize. That's the whole concept. I'm not going to go through the details of the 5 pillars. They're in there. You can see them there. System operator, that's the pillar 1. It was run by ESIG. NREL runs pillar 2, Imperial College 3. So it's education and outreach, etc. Just as a sort of the motto of GPST is get stuff done. And just as a sort of one example of it, if you go to our website, you'll see many more. But just as of today or tomorrow, you will get an email from us about this document that says there, I can't even read it myself with the resolution, but there's a policy briefing document coming out on resource adequacy, which is a very topical subject at the moment. It'll be released in the next day or two. You will get that. It's shown there. Just a bit of history. On the 21st of April, 2021, this group of people in the pictures, Secretary Granholm from the United States, Kwasi Kwarteng from the UK, Minister of Energy UK, various other CEOs and system operators launched the GPST. And during the COP itself on the 4th of November at 11:15 a.m., that's local British time obviously, there will be an update from some of the CEOs on progress since. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for the day, or for the 90 minutes. I've introduced myself. I will introduce Jonathan Pershing in a moment, US Deputy Special Envoy in Climate. That'll be then taken over by Steen Jensen, Vice President from EnergyNet DK, or sorry, EnergyNet Denmark, excuse me, they used to be called DK. Just to put a point on this, those system operators are the key to everything. They're the people who have to do this. They are the people that we all should be supporting, and that's where Steen is here. Then Veronica will take from Bluebird Energy Finance, will take over proceedings from then, and she'll interview the 4 people below there. One from Airgrid, one from ERCOT, one from AMO, one from Mescom. The Q&A then will happen. The Q&A will go through Slido. So go to slido.com and enter the code GPST20. We will not be taking questions through the chat. We'll do them all on Slido. And then Steen Jensen will close. So I want to introduce Jonathan Pershing. I think he is the perfect person to introduce this. First of all, he's definitely a policymaker. He's got a very, very important job, obviously, as a US Deputy Special Envoy on Climate. As far as I know, he reports to John Kerry, as his boss. But Jonathan is a geologist. And, you know, from my own point of view and my history of research, geologists actually, in terms of scientific training, are the most like electrical power engineers. I know that might sound strange or whatever, but to me, I've always come across geologists. They're trained in a very similar way to power engineering. I know people, you know, see that as a bit of a stretch, but it's not. Their basic training is very similar to electrical power engineering in terms of their sort of rigor. So Jonathan is the perfect person to introduce this because he is from the technology side, geology, and yet he's had vast experience in the policy arena. So Jonathan, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, super. Thank you so much, Mark. And I apologize for not being able to be with you on the call. I seem to have had a problem with the connection. So here's where I think Mark is right. If the engineers aren't getting this right, we really are not going to succeed. We in the policy community so rely on that expertise that nothing really proceeds unless we get the technology right. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for everyone for joining. I'm really glad to have a chance to start off. I am struck by Mark's introduction to me in that geological context. I think there's some relevance, although I'd like to think that my work with the Secretary of Energy and with the Department of Energy's national labs might have more immediacy. I am struck by the fact that as geologists, we are trained in thinking a little bit as an engineer does. And I have the additional advantage of having done work as a geological engineer. So I even have that slightly more directed link. I wanted to start off this session a little bit by building on some of the initial remarks that Mark made, and I think it'll be followed by others who will speak in a moment, but really about thinking of how this fits into the larger climate change agenda. I think that most of us who follow this closely, and I think that includes pretty much everyone on the line, is really paying attention to both the evolving science as well as the evolving technology. On the science side, most recently we had a report that came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out this past July, in which there was an indication that we are really exceeding the carrying capacity of our climate system. And that what we really want to do is try to hold the increase in global average temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We are not on that trajectory. To do that, we have to transition the global community. The global system has to transition to net zero emissions by 2050. And in that context, the better part of 40 to 50% reductions by the year 2030. That's a remarkably rapid change. And one sector is absolutely essential for that, which is the energy system, which collectively represents about 75% of global emissions, with the power system itself being a non-trivial share of that total. As our economy becomes electrified, this becomes an even larger and larger contribution. So as we think a little bit about electric vehicles or the use of electricity in the industrial sector, as we look at end-use activities in buildings, electricity a more and more central part of the overall system, in which case our need to decarbonize that system even more essential. There's at the same time been extraordinary progress on the renewable energy side. We look at the price declines. Those are things that all of you have worked both on and with in the context of your own work. It is a function partly of technological change, partly of economic incentives driven by policy, but there's a host of different investments that have been made, and the consequences show up. As we look around the world at recent investment in power generation, the bulk is now increasingly in renewable or zero carbon options as it becomes cheaper and cheaper to deploy. Just last year, as we think about the pandemic year, a kind of a crisis in terms of the global economy, our increase in renewable energy capacity was the better part of 250 plus gigawatts. That was the largest increase year on year ever seen. And we've now got the largest percentage in the global energy mix. It's just shy of 30%. That's great. But at the end of the day, if we look at some place like the International Energy Agency and its net zero by 2050 report, we need to further cut power sector emissions by just almost 60% by 2030 in order to be on that net zero path. So that brings me essentially back to the Power Consortium and the system transformation discussion. We're in a situation where we see increasing public and private sector commitments to renewable energy, which is great. But for those of us who are familiar with the grid and how it operates, we know that there are technical challenges for that operation and a need for planning and the management when the high penetration of renewables begins to dominate. And it's not that we don't have examples of success, and many of those on the phone today can speak to it specifically. I look at parts of the United States, like Texas, which has managed it well. I look at the global community and think about what's going on in Denmark. I look at the work that is underway in other parts of the world where this is, in fact, demonstrated. But the fact that it's demonstrated in some places has been insufficient to drive those more conservative voices out. I was in a conversation earlier this week with some colleagues from Mexico, and they point to the concern about reliability. And I think that's an information gap, not really a technology gap. But to overcome that, we have to demonstrate how we have succeeded in managing this transition in those places that are doing so, how we have retained reliability as we have made that penetration work at larger and larger levels, and how we bring that community development program into local communities where some combination of the reliability, but also the tax dollars, the jobs, and the employment play out properly. It's imperative that we have a smooth glide path so that the electric grid is not only decarbonized, but secure, it's resilient, and it's affordable. So at the end of the day, we have to think through what these pieces mean. And I would note in that context, certainly with the work that I was doing when I was at the Department of Energy and working in the policy shop there and the technology work, there's a big difference between a 75% renewable penetration rate and 100% renewable penetration rate, and what those transitions going to look like, both in terms of managing synchronous sources, generation, system controlled by inverter-based resources. That kind of technical dynamic is one that we're going to seriously have to work through. Of course, the GPST was created to help address these challenges. Looking at the climate impacts is a driver, but we can't just add enough renewable energy unless we also have the supporting infrastructure. And for most countries in the world, the grid was not designed to function in the context of somewhat variable supply and the need to manage that level of penetration. And therefore, we have to think about powering the grid, not the way we've done the last 100 years, but from a system operator perspective, what we're doing in the next 100. We've clearly got the list of topics that GPST is developing, right, working through. It's research and peer learning, it's technical assistance, it's foundational workforce development, it's technology adoption support for individual countries, and it's a series of data and tool requirements. I would note in my own conversations with countries, very many in this list, this has been an enormous priority. I had a meeting with the coordinating minister from Indonesia a couple of days ago. He's responsible for looking at the overall effort Indonesia is making on decarbonizing its economy, and he pointed to some real concerns about increasing penetration as he looks at the PLN structure and the management of renewables. I had a conversation when I was in South Africa about 3 weeks ago, discussions there with ESCOM, and there's a great deal going on there, but some of the debt problems that they're facing could limit their ability to manage a transformational system. How do we therefore both manage the debt and the technological imperatives that come from significant additional penetration of renewables? The GPST can help accelerate the global transition by bringing together system operators and key technical institutions. And let's be clear, this comes at a very important moment, this meeting, and our efforts. We're about to start, in a little less than 2 weeks, the climate negotiations in Glasgow. The United States has spent the last 9 months, really since I came into office, along with Secretary Kerry, who's the special presidential envoy on climate, and President Biden, to really try to ramp up global capacity and global engagement on the climate side. It's been lacking, and I would be quite blunt by suggesting that while there's been a great deal done by the private sector and by many states, the federal government during the previous administration did not prioritize climate. If anything, was opposed to some of these climate activities. But the current one has made it a much, much more central part of our overall work. How do we get to a net zero power sector by 2035? That was the commitment made by President Biden. How do we get to net zero emissions collectively economy-wide by 2050? That's part of the commitment. We're getting real success, not just in the US, but with other countries. We now have nearly 55% of global GDP countries representing 55% of global GDP committed to pathways consistent with holding the temperature increase to less than 1.5 degrees? Can we promote additional actions that secure additional commitments at the COP? How do we do that? This power sector conversation with this interplay between technology and policy is central. GPSD is essential for that. We're very, very pleased to host a GPSD event at the U.S. Pavilion during COP26. We hope that some of the ideas that are being framed in the context of this conversation will be elevated there. And we see this as an ongoing dialogue. We're not going to finish the work in the next couple of weeks, much less the next couple of months. This is going to be something we're going to have to work on and really extend ourselves to deliver. Because the alternative of seeing temperatures continue to rise is actually a pretty horrible outcome to contemplate. The kinds of damages that we see globally that we're seeing today, this may be the best we can have. So the wildfires and the floods and the droughts and the increased concerns over agricultural productivity, those are what happens at temperature rise of about 1.2 degrees. We go above 1.5 and inch towards 2 degrees of warming, the damages are much more severe. So this is a pretty central community. This group actually has at its fingertips the capacity to really drive a much more sustainable future, one that really does avoid those damages, but does so in such a way that the system that we rely on for our energy continues to be both robust and affordable. And so it's a great pleasure to have a chance to join you. I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from others. Look forward to hopefully providing the policy support that this technology community needs as we look at the integration across those two segments of our energy system to drive a future that we all would like to live in. So thanks so much, and let me turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. I'll pick that up about the geologist with you later. There is a very distinct link, but we won't go down that rabbit hole here today. I think Jonathan brought up an incredibly important point, though, that I think leads on to our next speaker. This whole idea of reliability, and that's the report that we're putting out in the next day that you'll all get an email. It's about resource adequacy, etc. It's the whole idea that we can do this at low cost and maintain reliability is key. So thank you for that, Jonathan. So we'll pass on now to Steen Jensen. Steen Jensen is a vice president for EnergyNet DK, which is the Danish system operator. And again, to put the point on what Jonathan said and what I'm saying, these people, the system operators, are at the center of all this. They are the people who have to manage this and do it on our behalf, and we should all be supporting them. So Steen, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you for the introduction,
Okay.
and I'm really glad that we had Jonathan introducing some of these topics, because from my point of view, it's very important also with this event to try to connect policy and technical issues. And I was glad to hear that he actually already covered some of the more technical issues, or at least told us that in policy they are really aware of some of the issues that have to be solved in order to reach the different targets. As he mentioned, IEA has made some different scenarios on how to reach the 2050 scenarios. And in those scenarios, wind power production actually needs to be increased with a factor 10 by 2050, and solar power actually has to be increased by a factor 20. So even though we are very well increasing the amount of renewables, and especially wind and solar, it's nearly not enough to cover what we actually want to reach, which is kind of very ambitious targets to reach. And this means that in order to get there, the power system is very central in not only integrating the renewable energy, but also making sure that the renewable energy are put out to the consumer and actually utilized to different and also new ways of using electricity. And that's important in order to reduce emission. And looking only at, you can say, electricity and not only renewables, that's actually also an increase with a factor 3 of the electricity system's role in the overall energy system. So you can say in the future, where we have to cope with these different issues, and you can perhaps say that the future is almost already here, or it's just around the corner, we actually do need a very strong electricity grid combining not only AC solutions, but also HVDC technologies into a balance in the system where we are actually able to handle security of supply and get a balance in the second, in the hour, and in the day during a whole year. And that's at the same time that we actually increase both the production with renewables and also the demand side. So if we take it kind of all in all, we do see a change in the power system dynamics. We also see a change in how we need to design it. And we also see a change in how we have to operate it day to day in the control rooms as a system operator. So if we look more into the system operator way to go into this, we have to enable increasing the amount of renewable electricity in the grid. We have to ensure an efficiently utilization through the grid and also in the operation to drive down emissions. And that's the core of what we're actually also trying to do in the global PST collaboration. For Energinet, who is a Danish TSO, and I know that Jonathan mentioned that it was a lot about sharing information, but from our point of view, of course, we have learned a lot on integrating a lot of renewable electricity in the system. But for us, it's actually also about sharing the different learnings, because the different system operators at the moment are learning hands-on in different ways with different types of technologies and with different types of existing systems. And in order to stay on the frontier of this development, we actually find it very important to engage in these collaborations, not only with other system operators, but also with universities and other aspects of the whole value chain handling electricity. And that's important for us in order to find resilient solutions that actually balances not only the energy and the grid, but also the reliability of the system and the costs that it actually puts on the green transition. So in the research that are put into focus in global PST, some of the issues are how to design and operate an inverter-dominated power system. It's how to design and operate our future control rooms. It's how to ensure resource adequacy in a system that is, you can say, more popular, turned upside down. And that's actually the topics that we are trying to cover here today in the different interviews. And with that, I'll give the word to Veronica, who will take us through the different aspects of the topics.
Thank you so much, Stine, for the introduction, and also to Jonathan for providing us with this really great context, and obviously for Mark and the whole GPST team for hosting us. Just for your context, and I actually went back into my notes, and I remembered it was around a year ago that we hosted the GPST at our BNEF Summit, and turns out it was exactly to this day a year ago. So maybe this is also an occasion to celebrate like an anniversary and take stock a little bit about the successes and have some really interesting case studies to share from the different system operators. Just to give you a little bit of context as well in terms of Bloomberg NEF and why I am here. Basically, we provide research and analysis on the energy transition, and we cover all the key sectors and industries that are impacted. One of the big exercises that we conduct each year is our new energy outlook. So it's a big modeling exercise that looks at the energy mix until 2050. So we run different scenarios, and one of them is the green scenario, which is based, it's a clean electricity and green hydrogen net zero pathway. And just to give you an idea of our 2021 NEO report, our green scenario forecasts, or it models 85% of primary energy will be renewables by 2050. At the moment, if we're only looking at wind and solar, that's 1.3%. So there's a massive opportunity and need to scale the uptake of renewables. And obviously that's going to have a massive impact on the power grid as well. So as Mark mentioned earlier, we will be taking a little bit of a tour around the world, and we have system operators from 4 continents, 4 countries represented, and they'll be able to share some of their, very local specific challenges they've been facing, some of the tools and successes, tools they've used, successes they've achieved, and obviously, hopefully inspiring other system operators on, getting more renewables reliably onto the grid, and of course, getting the right policy support at the same time. So, just before we dive into the conversations, though, a reminder, there is a chance for you to ask questions afterwards. So please do not use WebEx, but please do use Slido. So just type slido.com in your browser or on your phone, and then enter the event passcode code GPST20, and then you'll be able to ask questions. By all means, let us know which speaker your question is directed at. We'll have around 20 minutes after the interviews. And then this event is also being recorded. So eventually, if you want to rewatch it at some point or share it with others, you can do that afterwards. And if you want to share any of the insights from the event, you're also very welcome to tweet about it. And you could use the hashtag @global_PST. So that's just a little bit of additional information. And now I would love to welcome John O'Sullivan, who's the head of future markets at EirGrid in Ireland. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Beryl.
So we really want to kind of dive into some very, market-specific challenges that you've been encountering. And obviously, just for our audience to be aware as well, is that, these are just really examples and snippets to give you an insight of challenges and hopefully give you inspiration. But Jono, what is, Ireland has set incredibly ambitious renewables targets, and what are the challenges you're facing to meet those targets, and anything else that is very specific to your system?
I think I go back, and it's really probably about 2008, there was a fundamental policy change from government, and it was aligned with Northern Ireland. And in Ireland's case, that's a very important political issue. And they basically wanted to move from effectively a fully fossil fuel power system to 40% renewables by 2020. And so this is 2008. At the time, most people were saying you couldn't probably do it, but most of the issues at the time were where people were looking at average outputs. And the one thing that we've had for the last decade in Ireland and Northern Ireland is full political support for those policy targets through different governments. And that's a major requirement. If you have changing governments and stuff like and changing policies, that's difficult. So everything I say is in the context of unambiguous political support, which is necessary, I think, for this. And I won't speak about that again. But at that stage, operationally, we were saying we couldn't do it. We weren't comfortable with it. And that was the story around the world. And largely, the technical issues then being discussed around the world were what I would call issues associated with small scale penetration of wind. They were looking collectively at the system and saying, I have enough conventional, I can go to 5% wind because I still have 95%. So we'll do things like net load, wind capacity, credit factors, that basically, as long as this is small, we don't mind, and we're going to treat it like that. Now, the big issue in that operationally at the time was to realize there was probably a couple of falsehoods in that, and Mark Twain probably said it best. It's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you think that is that ain't that does. And fundamentally, a number of real, I would have been asked at that stage, and I would have market and operational background to lead the work that our company now wants to do to facilitate renewable integration. So the policy objectives allowed the organization of TSO, which we classically very conservative, to take a facilitatory role with respect to renewables and actually put people dedicated to solving these problems to do it. So I had the good fortune of being asked to lead the work on renewable integration from an operational perspective, where yes, you have to build grid and to connect things, but to me, the operational challenges at that time for 40% renewable were much greater than people understood. And largely it came out, the reason why they were much greater is because people were thinking about it as 40% of the system. Sure, I'll always have 60% of the system coming from fossil fuel. And the thing that's unique about Ireland and Northern Ireland is we're an island system. We have HVDC interconnection, but we are a synchronous area all on our own. And fundamentally, the physics of fundamentally transforming to an inverter-based technology solely is at a synchronous area. And so I would argue very strongly that the thought process of synchronous areas, if you can solve it in Ireland and Northern Ireland at 100% real-time operation, those principles apply to every other synchronous area. The scale might be different, but the principle is a major thing. So in that thought process, I was asked to solve some of these issues with my team. The first thing we did was there's a range of challenges that are going to happen that people aren't thinking about. And all we did in that world was say it's not about the average, it's about the peak. So sometimes the wind blows, sometimes it doesn't. And so in order to get average 40%, at times you're going to have to be up at 75, 80%, 90%, 100% of the system coming from new non-synchronous technologies. And what technical challenges that is. Now, once you ask that question, and then you do a lot of technical analysis to see what the issues are, answers come out of that they technical solutions to the fundamental challenges that are facing you. And when you get into that, I can talk about at any level of the technical, but I'll keep it at a high level for now, is fundamentally those technical challenges are all solvable. Now, over the decade, then that set of studies got done between 2008 and 2010, building on work that Mark O'Malley was asked to lead with some system operators by policymakers north and south. Would this be a good thing? So when the policy got set, there was this all-island grid study there behind it with policymakers. But then there was a lot of technical work to be done after that, and I would argue economic work as well. Out of that set of studies in 2010, we basically launched a program to basically call the DS3 program, Delivering a Secure, Sustainable System, to say, here is the program of work that we've identified that needs to address these technical issues. And by the way, there's some monetary aspects to it. So the so what out of technical studies was a 10-year-long program of work. It was a moonshot saying, we have to be able to, in order to do 40% renewables, connect a lot of renewables, give them firm connections or network, but most importantly, operate a system regularly up to 75% of the whole system coming from wind or non-synchronous technologies in a synchronous area. And if we don't do that, it won't be an effective policy making. And if we don't do that, even if you have all the winds, you'll be just dispatching them down and not using them.
And
That's
John,
so.
can I jump in for 1 second? And we also want to use this session to just explain and make some of those terms more approachable to maybe some people that are not as familiar with them. Can you very briefly outline, the difference between a synchronous machine and inverter-based resources?
The best way I can describe it is this. One has, and it comes down to Tesla, one basically is linked by the laws of electromagnetism physics to the system. It just happens because it is, and it's an interaction between electricity and magnetism. The electronics have none of that. So anything that has electronics doesn't have this store of energy, which is electromagnetism. Now, the importance of that is that fundamental concept has made the resilience, and I use the word resilience, not just reliability, resilience in the power system, that most people never have to know when there's a fundamental issue in the power system because it just works. I have to know about a system operator, and Julia and Luke need to know about it. But I'm basically saying that electromagnetism is really critical. And if you don't replace it or manage it, you're in trouble. Now that manifests itself in 3 high-level issues. The first one is that's a real limiting issue if you don't manage it, but it can be managed. So it's not saying you can't go to 100%. In fact, you absolutely can, but you need to know how much electromagnetism you have and the implications if you don't. And that's system strength, it's oscillations, a range of things that you will hear the various panelists here talking about. The second one, from a renewable point of view, is understanding that the power system is moving from one that is fossil fuel and very predictable to one that's more variable. Now, a lot of people at the top are saying wind farms are awful, they're too variable. Farms are simply best performing units I've ever met as a CSO. The issue is I don't want them to close their output. I want to curtail their output, and they'll sit there for a long time. So the big issue on that is weather dependent system. You have to manage the uncertainty of the weather as an issue. Folks, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
we had a little bit of a
Can you
delay
hear me?
with you.
Yeah, okay.
Now you, yeah,
But
you're back.
keep and the last one then really, so yes, you have to manage the uncertainty of the wind, and then one of the key things that we did at that time is understanding it's not about the forecast, because you will always have a forecast that will be wrong. It's about how you manage errors in the forecast. When you're forecasting, instead of 1% of the system or 5%, you're forecasting 80% of the energy on the system. And if you're out by 3 hours on a 10,000 megawatt forecast and my peak is 7,000 megawatts, you're sort of in trouble. So it's not that the wind is variable is an issue in and itself. It's that it changes the predictability, and that can be all managed. So technically, when you get into the first one, the big issue there is the system brittleness. A lot of people were saying at the time that if you add wind, 5% on the system, it actually helps the stability of the system. And I said, no, it doesn't, because if you go to higher levels, at some level, you won't have that electromagnetism. That effectively makes the system brittle. This lack of electromagnetism. Now, that doesn't mean you can't harden steel. You put in hardened steel with concrete, you've got steel reinforced. And that's effectively the engineering challenge, is recognizing that these are issues, first of all, and then saying there are solutions. The problem when you then get into the solutions is, how do I get the money in an effective market way? And that's sort of, that's a more answer that GPST isn't necessarily addressing directly, for good reason, because economics is a social science and people have their own views on that. Now, I would argue very strongly about what the answers. At least the physics, I think we'll all be here on the physics is an immutable law of physics, and therefore we'll be all pretty consistent on it. But the three issues at the highest level that we saw, the brittleness of the system needs to be managed, but it can be managed. It's not about having a perfect forecast in a weather dependent system. It's about managing the uncertainty of that forecast that comes out. And fundamentally, where we were getting our resilience in the future for the power system wasn't going to be coming solely from conventional plant. And when we were up at 75% of the whole system coming from wind, we needed to get it in a different way, in a different areas and different technologies. And that's what the DS3 program did. Just to surmise the outcome of the DS3 program, given it's now 2021, was we are now operating at 75% renewable penetration in real-time operations. We hit 43% renewables in Ireland and Northern Ireland last in 2020. So we've effectively exceeded the targets, and all the wind farms and the supporting complementary resilience technologies have found enough money to make commercial investments to be ready in time for that. So the transition to 75% capability has been achieved. Our problem is that, sorry, Brittany, go ahead. Yeah.
Jonah, could you touch on some of the actual solutions you came up with in terms of addressing the brittleness of the system?
The brittleness was fundamentally what we actually did, and I think Julia may be talking some of it. What we actually did was did a really detailed set of studies, and what we saw is that probably with the existing capability on the system, you could get up to 75% SNSP if you could keep on at least 8 or 9 conventional plant on the system. Now, if you keep it on 8 or 9 conventional plant, it means your inertia, the strength of the system, the size of it is relatively big. But then the question is, but if I have so much conventional plant on, can I actually run the renewables to meet my 40%? And what we found was, if we could fundamentally lower the megawatt output of all those generators over a period of time, that they could produce the same inertia with half the megawatts, take off 1,000 megawatts of it, and that's quite a lot. That of our smallest peak at nighttime, 1,000 megawatts is about 35-40% of the load, which is great. So we get them to reduce that. You could maintain the stability and maintain the size, and therefore all of that, you could get up to 75. And the brittleness wasn't a factor. The issue is, if you couldn't do that, you were going to have to do more. And where we at, it just so happened the conventional plant did that. So I'm basically saying our solution was a little bit different, saying, yeah, I need to be able to up there, but if the conventional plant want to lower their mins, I'll keep them on the bars, provided they can make the money. So the technical solution can be get rid of all the conventional plants and solve that problem, or keep the conventional plant but get them to lower down. Our answer for 2030 is different, right? In the 2030 context, the DS3 program was the 2020 program. We now got Shaping Our Electricity Future. It covers operations, markets, and networks, and we can talk about all of that. But we are aiming for, I think it's going to be 80% renewables on average annually by 2030, which basically means we have to be able to have the ability by 2030 to operate up 100% of the whole system coming from wind and solar on a synchronous area. And we believe it's technically possible. We've outlined the plan that's required and the issues are, but that part we are definitely going to have to look at replacing the conventional plant, which is synchronous condensers and potentially grid forming, but we can get into that discussion. I wouldn't be a fan of grid forming for 2030 at this stage, not because it may not be the solution. I just can't see it being there at scale to solve my problem that we currently have. And so that's technical issue one.
And Donna, just before we wrap our conversation, and we'll be coming back for the Q&A session, I just want to quickly ask you, you mentioned at the beginning, you know, there's unambiguous political support. So from your perspective, like, what is the one thing you would, what would you like to see from policymakers at this stage? How can they support you and, you know,
I think obviously network build is a big policy support that's required. But in any case, I think it's more than that. I think the big issue, and it's slightly outside GPST, is that fundamentally the high level market design, which incentivizes the money, is fundamentally going to have to change and address some of these resilience issues. And I can talk at some detail on that, but the policymakers need to understand with the regulators, and it's not clear to me that it's well understood, that is a regulator, an independent regulator, supposed to frustrate or facilitate policy or be independent of policy? And so I would say the structures that we've set up, particularly in Europe and the United States, is that you have a regulator for this and you have policymakers. But if the regulator is independent, what role do they play in their market design that actually supports the long-term outcomes in an effective and cost-effective manner? And the challenge with that is, I think the economics is wrong. It's neoliberal economics that doesn't consider the right issues. And on top of that, it's not clear to me that the policymakers' policy ambitions are necessarily reflected in the actions of regulators to the extent, because they have to maintain independence from the policymakers in the way they've been set up. So I think unambiguous support where you need is absolutely needed. But I think the market has to change, and the role of regulators needs to be clarified for them to the policy market, so that yes, we want to achieve your ambition, but not give it to your friend, because that's why regulators, we've got to set up a proper market that this works. And I think the nature of that market has to change, but we have to clarify the role of regulators with respect to policymakers' ambitions, because if we don't, it's just becoming a very confused space.
Thanks, Jono. And I think at this point, we're going to wrap this conversation. But so again, everybody who's joining us, do submit your questions via Slido, and Jono will be back later on. So now I would like to welcome my next guest, and she's joining us from the US. It's Julia Matesovyan, who's the lead planning engineer at ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Julia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And actually similar to Ireland, and which maybe not all of our viewers are aware of, also the ERCOT and the grid in Texas is run, you know, is not connected to the rest of the US, which creates its own challenges and setup. But what's kind of the one thing you want to highlight, and kind of the challenge you've been tackling over the last years that really stood out for you, and that, you know, is making a big impact on the grid?
Yeah, we are very similar to Irish system, although larger in size, and but we also have to plan for large generation loss. So with that, we are pretty similar to Ireland. And so I just wanted to focus on one challenge, and it doesn't mean that it's most important challenge, or we don't have any other. Just wanted to bring this up as one example, and so that's something Jono was talking about as well. So as we started seeing influx of wind resources on our system around 2013, 2014 timeframe, we were also concerned about reduced inertia in the system and maintaining stable frequency. As being island system, this was one of the concerns, to be able to maintain frequency internally. And so with increasing shares of wind generation serving higher portions of demand, there was this concern that traditional generation is being retired or being offline at times.
And so you mentioned inertia, like, can you explain that term for our audience a little bit more and what it implies?
Yeah, so Jonna kind of started that conversation already, but maybe I'll provide a little bit more detail. So as some of you probably know, today's grid still consists of large share of traditional generators, and they are all rotating mass, and they rotate with the speed that is proportional to grid frequency. So it's basically they are all in synchronism, rotating together, and the speed is 60 cycles per second or 50 cycles per second in some other parts of the world. US is 60 hertz, Europe is 50 hertz. And so this frequency, grid frequency, is used as one of the measures of grid health. And so during normal operating conditions, production and consumption are in balance. But when one generator fails, the demand doesn't feel it. So you still have same amount of energy consumption on the grid. And this loss of generation needs to be substituted by something. And so there is temporary energy that's being provided through inertial response from rotational energy stored in rotating mass of those synchronous machines. And as this energy is being extracted, the machines are slowing down, and that manifests itself as reduction in system frequency. So this inertial response, it's temporary response, typically lasts just for a few seconds, but it allows time for controls on power plants to sense that there is a disturbance and inject extra power into the grid to replace that lost generation, and also restore grid frequency back to normal and allow all synchronous generators to speed up again and back to 60 hertz frequency. So as Jono mentioned, wind, solar storage, they are all inverter-based resources. So they're using power electronics to connect to the grid. So whenever a generator fails on the grid, there is no this automatic connection or inherent response from those resources. It doesn't mean that they cannot help, and I'll talk about it.
Yeah. And the fact that you mentioned that it's oftentimes only for a few seconds, is that because that is all the, inertia can only give you a few seconds of that energy, or it could actually be longer? It's just
it's just that inertia. It's very similar to to a car. So if you stop pressing on gas, you'll still continue moving for some time, but then speed of the car will reduce and you'll come eventually to complete stop. So that inertia contribution of each generator is defined as how much energy they can deliver from the rotational energy before they completely stop.
And so with you guys, yeah, and with you guys adding more wind resources to the grid and dealing with reduced inertia, like what are some kind of the tools you were using to kind of explore solutions?
Right. So we did it all preemptively. We didn't wait until we got into trouble. We just kind of realized that synchronous machines are going away, and do we have concerns with inertia? So we started doing a number of studies similarly to what Jonna mentioned, and we identify what is the critical inertia level that we need to keep online to allow sufficient time for existing frequency controls to respond during generation loss events. So this is something what Jonna mentioned, keeping number of machines, if you will, to keep online to keep frequency stable for now until we get new solutions. And so we were, through the studies, we were successful identifying critical inertia level of 100 gigawatt seconds, and so that can be translated to a number of machines depending on size of machines you have. We also identified amounts of reserves that we need to arrest system frequency once it starts declining and stabilize it, bring it back to normal. And we determined it based on different inertia levels, starting from critical inertia level and going up, because we need different amounts of reserves at different inertia levels. That's what we realized through the studies. And then I want to point out that this frequency containment reserve that can be provided by thermal generation, but also by inverter-based resources, even by current technology of inverter-based resources, and also by demand response. And ERCOT successfully using demand response for many years now for provision of frequency containment reserve. And then if frequency,
I want to very quickly touch on what demand response is.
So demand response, what we use in ERCOT, we have large industrial loads that are large industries, and they have under frequency relays, so they sense when frequency is low, and there is a certain setting when they just trip offline and they provide it as a fast frequency response service. So basically, if we lost a generator and then we trip this industrial load, it helps us balance the system quickly. And this is not your load shedding, this is voluntary participation, and they get paid for this as a service. And so one of the things I also wanted to mention, that inverter-based resources within solar storage, then they can provide similar type of response. So it's very quick, much faster than conventional frequency response from synchronous generators. And so if they participate in the service and provide this response, it allows us reduce amount of total reserve that we need because of the speed of response. And we can also reduce critical inertia. So again, going back to Jonah's example, we can reduce number of synchronous generators we keep online just for inertia provision. And we developed applications in the control room that allow us to track inertia, forecast it several hours ahead, look at inertia several hours ahead, decide how much reserve we need for frequency response, and also monitor reserve sufficiency in real time. So it provides us with a lot of situational awareness.
And then after you've run all those models, and what are some of the very tangible outcomes you've had?
So as I mentioned, this is not the only challenge we have, but with that measure and other innovative solutions that ERCOT has implemented, we were to date successful at operating at 66% penetration of renewable resources, so that being wind and solar, for a sustained period of time, and this is one of the highest levels for the systems of this size and for this level of interconnections, which we don't have many.
That's awesome. And
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in some areas people went for implementing inertia service. We currently still we didn't get there yet, even though we prepared ourselves for this. We don't have inertia service yet, but we have good situational awareness and robust frequency response products that allow us to operate a system at these levels of inverter-based resources.
And then what do you think is needed next in terms of, running more models? Like, do we need new technologies, like new, transmission lines? What's kind of on your radar?
Yeah, so this is just one of the concerns, that we have, the frequency concerns, also probably not the major one. Jonah, I think, mentioned grid strengths and transient stability and oscillation damping. And so all of this services that been traditionally and inherently provided by synchronous generation. Now that synchronous generation is going away, it needs to be provided by inverter-based resources. Some of the services already today can be successfully provided by existing inverter-based resource technology, and then there are also advanced controls that are being developed, and Jonah mentioned grid forming that is coming and can provide some of the services as well. So one of the challenges in ERCOT that we're seeing is to understand capabilities of inverter-based resources to provide services, and then define requirements for services and how we're going to qualify resources to provide the services and allow inverter-based resources to participate.
My last question for you, Julia, what is, the one thing you would ask policymakers to do and kind of support your work?
I think probably I would probably talk about transmission here, is that some of the solutions, they're better done ahead of the problem and in a more holistic way. And this is where it's hard when you cannot directly justify a certain solution being implemented because you're building it ahead of, say, inverter-based resources developing. And this is where we need support from policymakers to kind of support more holistic solutions ahead of the problem arising.
Great. Julia, thank you so much for your insights and for taking us on a little excursion to Texas. And we're now going to hop over to Australia. So my next guest is Luke Robinson, and he's the manager for Grid and Performance and Integration at AEMO, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator. Luke, welcome.
Hello, Veronica. Thank you.
And Luke is a trooper because this is all live, so it's in the middle of his night in Australia. So thanks again
It is 3 a.m.
for being here. So Luke, I know there's been you had a massive power outage in South Australia last year. And can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that impacted your grid?
Yeah, look, we did have a significant event in fact in 2016, which really highlighted the need to develop and enhance our modelling capabilities. As you know, AEMO is responsible for operating the power system on the East Coast. We have a significant increase in wind, solar, battery connections all across the power system, and certainly we've had some challenges and some successes, which I'm very keen to talk through. In some regions of the NEM, in fact, we've seen very high levels of non-synchronous penetration, similar to what Jono mentioned, and in Tasmania, the small island state south of Victoria, we've seen system non-synchronous penetration upward of 94%, owing to a large fleet of flexible hydropower, strong wind resources, and DC interconnection to the mainland. In South Australia, as you mentioned, in wine country, with the capital of Adelaide on the land of the traditional owners, the Kaurna people, there's exceptional wind resources, and we've seen that increase over the last decade. It's at the forefront of the energy transition, and the changing generation mix and demand profile has led to some complex operational challenges and certainly some pioneering engineering solutions. We've seen significant wind resource now with around 2 gigawatts of wind, 2 gigawatts of distributed solar, plus additional 300 megawatts of large-scale solar, compared to a peak demand of around 3.4 gigawatts. We've also seen in 2016, in fact, the last coal-fired power station in South Australia cease operation, and we're seeing operational demand continue to decline. All of these factors have created operational challenges that we're certainly managing and working through in collaboration with the GPST and other collaborators.
And what do you think are maybe some of the misconceptions in terms of bringing more renewables to the grid that, people that don't work in the industry are not aware of, including policymakers?
Look, I think one common, perhaps, misconception is that it's all about supply and demand. That's certainly extremely important. But as we've heard from Jono and Julia as well, it's quite different in terms of the performance and the technical characteristics between an inverter and a rotating mass that's electromechanically coupled to the power system. Consider it like the conductor of an orchestra that's keeping everyone in time. Large rotating synchronous machines provide a reference for everyone to follow, for all the resources to follow. If the conductor were to drop her baton, a disturbance occurs. Some may stay in time following their own internal reference, but others may lose time and even go out of sync with the rest. And these technical characteristics are extremely important, and analysing those, understanding how to operate the power system, assessing the technical envelope is extremely important, in addition to understanding that supply-demand balance.
What are some of the modeling techniques you've been using, and timeframes that are involved to actually solve those issues? Again, if countries make really ambitious, set very ambitious targets that need to be met, and there's a lot of conversations going on how the next 10 years, the next decade, now it's even 9 years, whatever you like, incredibly crucial. So how realistic is it to actually implement and address those technical and physical challenges?
There's certainly a range of measures that are needed, both in terms of modelling and ensuring the accuracy of those models. And AEMO utilise power system models that directly represent the software that's in the control systems that are operating on the physical power system to understand and assess the technical envelope. There's other things as well. We've seen new technologies, batteries, again, South Australia. They've contributed to providing reliability services and grid security services. We're currently finalising the commissioning of large synchronous condensers in the South Australian region, which helps stabilise the power system in an environment with high levels of renewable generation, and enabling us to fully utilise the resources that are connecting to the power system. And we're continuing to work with stakeholders to enhance under-frequency load shedding capabilities, ensure that our safety nets remain effective as we transition to higher and higher levels of distributed resources with 2 gigawatts in that region and a significant capacity in other regions of the NEM also.
What's kind of in your day-to-day, what is giving you the biggest headaches in terms of potentially even related, to stakeholder engagement and actually getting things done, opposed to just the technical challenge?
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly there are no shortage of challenges. One to note would be managing the data and models that we use to analyse the power system is a challenge in terms of managing the interoperability of those tools, ensuring that we address legacy model issues, transition to new versions of software, and that we really develop the future tools that are needed to assess the stability and performance of the power system. Even our most accurate tools have their own limitations, and they're things that are being explored in collaboration with the founding system operators of the GPST to look at the tools that are needed, the services that are required to support operating the power system with high levels of inverter-based resources and renewable generation.
And also, obviously, looking back as system operators for decades, you've monitored the grid, and it was like business as usual. And now with renewables, coming online, it's brand new technology. So it's a very big change for system operators. So to what extent, do you have to change, the existing grid to match and meet the renewables coming online? Or is it just, are you trying to match the renewables and squeezing them into existing, what exists? What is needed here? Is there maybe a different mindset? Do we have to think about the technology differently? Is there things we don't know yet?
It's a great question. I mean, I think Jono mentioned this earlier as well. When we were designing the system with small, low levels of inverter-based resources, it was predicated on having those synchronous resources in the system. And as we move to higher and higher levels of inverter-based resources, we need to look at redesigning everything from the actual primary plant, the transmission lines that connect to renewable resources, the reactive control devices that manage voltages on the power system so that it can operate satisfactorily, to power quality equipment and protection equipment. AEMO's ambition is to continue to deliver a safe, reliable and affordable energy supply to consumers and to operate the power system with 100% instantaneous penetration of renewables by 2025. So certainly the collaboration through GPST, leveraging the insights that we gain from the system operators and even working with our local research organisation, CSIRO, to progress those initiatives is vitally important to transition to increasing levels of IBR, which inverter-based resources, that is increasingly complex as we navigate this transition.
Can you touch on that a little bit more in terms of how the collaboration with the GPST has helped, and maybe how it can help to bring, you know, other system operators on board that are not yet part of the consortium?
Certainly, I'd say really the research agenda put together by the founding system operators was a foundational piece of work that was delivered that really highlighted the key research questions against a range of topics that are relevant to managing the energy transition. As well, the system services and analysis tools work that's been developed through the GPST collaboration and the resource adequacy that Mark mentioned earlier. This really focuses the industry and helps build that collaboration that is required. There's a huge body of work that's needed over the next 10 years or more, and really we need all the support we can get to achieve the success that we're looking to achieve.
And given the big scale of the work that is needed, do you have any thoughts that you want our audience to take away from today?
Any one thought, I suppose it would be to continue to engage with the GPST, engage with the system operators, because again, it's really that through collaboration with a range of industry stakeholders, through building awareness, understanding, learnings, sharing those learnings, sharing those with the developing country system operators as well. I think that will be to our mutual benefit.
Luke, thank you for your interesting insights. And like all the other speakers, Luke will be joining us for the Q&A session in a moment too. But this brings us now to our last conversation. So I'll be joined by Gav Herford, who is National Control Manager at Eskom in South Africa. Gav, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, and again, just a very quick reminder to everybody, any questions you may have, you can do that. You can submit them via Slido, and then we'll have some ready to go once we start with the Q&A session. But Gab, coming to you, so from all the conversations we're having today, South Africa is the only developing nation. So what is unique to your scenario and to your grid and the challenges that you're facing?
Thanks, Vera. I was actually listening quite interestingly. It's sort of a glimpse into our future, if I can put it that way, listening to some of the other speakers. In South Africa, you know, we're just really getting out of the starting blocks. Our first commercial plant put online in 2014. Since then, we've been gradually adding. So we've got about 5.6 gigawatts of renewables now connected to our grid. To put that in context, the grid is about a 35 gigawatt grid. So it's really quite a small penetration at this stage. And the problems that we have thought about, we haven't yet seen. So we really haven't seen a major impact from these renewables. I think like many of the system operators who've spoken previously, when we started out, and we looked at these renewables, we weren't quite sure about them. Initially, we tried to ignore them. Then we got a little bit interested and looked at what they could do. And then we started getting really interested in what they can do. And I think we've now moved to a point where we're sort of wondering, well, quite useful, what else can we do with them? And as we're adding more and more renewables to the grid, I mean, we've got ambition to add over the next 12, possibly 24 months, we're going to be doubling the amount of renewables connected to the grid. So it will become a little bit more significant. And then within the next 8 years or so, it's going to be triple. So where we are quite interested in them as a curiosity at the moment, they're not really giving us a lot of trouble. We are expecting a lot of interesting things to happen on our grid. South Africa is what we call an isolated grid, I guess similar to Ireland. We don't have interconnections to other large power companies, other large power utilities. And in Southern Africa, we are more than 10 times larger than our neighbors. So we don't have a lot of ability to stabilize our grid relying on our neighbors. But because of that, it makes the grid very interesting. We'll start to see where as a continental type grid may not experience extreme events, when we have small events happening on the system, you will start to see that on our grid because it's so isolated and we don't get the events smoothed out by the interconnections to other large utilities. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. The other problem we have in South Africa is that, yes, we are trying to obviously deal with climate change and bring in as many renewables as possible. We've also had a problem in the country over the last few, let's say 10 years or so, where we're actually running out of capacity. Our coal fleet, we're predominantly coal. Our coal fleet is now becoming very old. The average age of most of them is over 40 years. Sadly, they have not received the attention and the refurbishment that they've needed, and so their performance is actually very bad. And so we've gotten ourselves into a situation where for the last 13 years or so, we've actually been load shedding on and off simply because we can't meet the demand. So there's this urgency around.
Yeah, just quickly, just in terms of, you want to very quickly explain load shedding, just to make sure.
Right. So I think some of the others talked about supply and demand, where we try and balance the grid and keep it in synchronism at more or less 50 hertz here or 60 hertz in America. The normal approach from a system operator would be to dispatch more generation to meet the demand for the customers. When you run out of the capacity to dispatch, then the only other option you do have is actually to disconnect your customers and actually switch them off, remove them from the grid. And so that's the term we use, is load shedding, simply to remove the load. And obviously devastating to an economy, devastating to the customers, certainly not the service that they would expect, and certainly not the service they deserve. So we have had this problem, and it's going to get worse as our fleet gets to retirement age. And one of the things that we're now doing is trying to increase the building of renewables in the country, just to try and make up that difference from as we shutting down the fleet, as the fleet's performance is not keeping up with demand, try and introduce more and more renewables.
And given your coal power plants are so old at this point, like, what is the, what's the expected inflection point where you're hoping to, really be able to rely on renewables? Because by the sound of it, you don't have much time.
Yeah, that's a very good question. At this stage, we don't yet have the luxury of that answer. I think that's probably for us what makes interactions with some of our partners around the world, including GPST, it gives us an opportunity to leverage off of what they've done already. They've gone before us, they've learned some of these lessons, and it gives us the opportunity to work with them and answer some of these questions, and specifically in the South African context, where we can take our grid and we can see what the learnings are, get some best brains in the industry to come and help us to answer some of these questions that are very specific to us as well. We think we could most probably manage about 50%, but at this point, there needs to be a lot of study and backup behind that number.
And I mean, also, if you think about it, like you can build all the renewables potentially, right? Let's say you get a lot of investment, but then does your existing transmission grid, would it support all those renewables? And would you have to build new transmission lines, etc.? Is that, just renewables are maybe not a solution, because it has ripple effects, right, on other parts of the grid?
Sure. So I think Jonathan mentioned earlier when he was in South Africa, and you mentioned the massive debt burden that we do have as Eskom, as the company. And one of the big challenges for us to unlock the potential, and South Africa has an amazing potential for renewable energy. But to unlock that, we're going to have to change the structure of our grid. Up until now, what we've done is we've built coal-fired power stations, and really large coal-fired power stations on top of the coal fields, whereas the renewable resources are actually more remote. And so we don't have a lot of network out in those remote areas of the country. And we're going to have to build out a really massive part of our transmission grid. Clearly, to do that is only going to take time. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of political will, but we're also going to be building so much compared to what we've done in the past that it's going to involve other industry players. We're going to need to start stimulating, for example, people who build power lines. We don't have a large industry in the country for that. So there's going to be this knock-on effect. But certainly the transmission network, it's absolutely imperative that we build that. Otherwise, we won't be able to unlock all the potential renewable energy that's out there available.
And what is going to be the role of policy in your specific case? Like, what do you need from policymakers, and what's the current state of mind towards renewables?
Yeah, so I heard some of the other comments around this, and I must say maybe we're spoiled here, and maybe it's the urgency of the load shedding. The policies, we do have a policy document. It's already mapped out the way forward for the next until 2030. It basically just says build a lot of renewables. So I think from that point of view, certainly for the short term to the medium term, I don't believe that there's a lot of need on the policy side for the renewable generations themselves. However, we're also going through unbundling in the country at the moment. So we're kind of doing everything all together. We're busy unbundling the transmission company for the first time. And that is going to require quite a lot of policy change, not so much.
And unbundling, just to break it down for us again.
Right. So most of you will be familiar with European and American power companies where you've separated out the generation, transmission, and the distribution type of functions. In Eskom, we're one of the last remaining what we refer to as vertically integrated utility, where we're all in one company. So we have our generators, we have our transmission company, we have our distribution company, all integrated into one parent company, and we operate as a single company. So the generation, up until 2014, when we introduced the renewables, all generation in the country was owned and operated by Eskom. There were some exceptions in municipal areas, but for the most part, it was owned, it was transmitted, and it was distributed by Eskom. Now, breaking it up and separating these separate entities also give us an opportunity to try and find some, first of all, some competition in the generation space, but secondly, just to try and show the different parts of the company and try and optimize these parts. So, for example, transmission is now becoming very apparent what's required of the transmission company in order to unlock the renewable industry in the country. And so it gives us those types of benefits as well as the optimization.
So, Gav, by the sound of it, obviously, there's a lot for you to do in South Africa, and what keeps you motivated? It sounds like incredibly difficult, and given where you are compared to, some of the other countries we just heard about.
Right, I wouldn't say it's difficult. I listen to some of the people, and I get the impression that it is quite scary. They've gone through quite a lot of learnings and managed a lot of challenges along the way. We have the benefit of actually learning from people because we're a little bit slower in this journey. We're behind. So we have the opportunity to learn from those who've gone ahead of us. There's also now amazing opportunities that weren't there before. For example, TST and some of the other partners around the world who are actually making available the research, making available the resources, and having sessions where we can actually speak to them. You'd be amazed at just speaking to other system operators, listening to their experiences. And something as simple as giving a problem a name is sometimes useful because then we all have a common language. So, I think collaboration, we haven't seen this level of collaboration among system operators ever, I don't believe. So that is really helpful. So I don't think it's sort of a burden for us. It's quite exciting. We've got a lot to look forward to.
That's fantastic. And my last question for you, Gav, in terms of, would you have any recommendations to other developing nations, other countries that maybe are even behind South Africa in terms of, getting renewables online and embracing this big step?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I actually had a call from one of our neighbors from a system operator here in Southern Africa, and they were just about to commission their first renewable plant, and they started asking a lot of questions, similar to the questions that we were asking back in 2013, 2014. And I must say, I had a good giggle at myself because the questions they were asking seemed to be a bit ridiculous now that we've had experience. And so it was an opportunity then to also just, explain to them that these things are not as scary as people make them out to be. They are actually more robust than one would think. system operators are very conservative people. And so what you find is that they invent all these reasons why we should do things. And I think perhaps, if we can take away to the policymakers and to the other developing countries, listen to the system operators, but also don't let them get away with murder. Perhaps, that would encourage those who are behind us to sort of get going with the journey. And it is really worthwhile.
Great, Gav. Yeah, that's very inspiring words there. And it's also great to hear your point of view from a developing nation. So thank you for that. And we want to leave time for questions. So we're going to bring all the other speakers back on the screen and see what we have for the for our speakers here. So I'm just taking a look at the questions. Oh,
Sorry,
yeah.
Vera, just to say to everyone in the audience that we are going to sort of prioritize the sort of questions that we think are most appropriate for this session, and we will answer all the other questions offline. Okay.
Awesome. Or Mark, if you want to kind of pass on the first question you may have come across.
I don't know. You go for it. It's Eckhart. Eckhart's question is with 9 volts is a good one. And I know Eckhart, so go for it.
Okay, a question from Eckhart. It's directed at Jono. Would you agree that policymakers and regulators should start the process to reduce the value of megawatts per hour and increase the value of ancillary services?
Short answer is yes, but I think it's a more nuanced answer than that, and I think it's linked with Guy Nicholson's third question there as well. In essence, I think if you design the markets right, the answer will come out. The problem is we're fundamentally not designing the markets right, and it goes back to actually a design issue in 1896. So the one thing that I will give Thomas Edison, but Nikola Tesla beat him over the head, upside down, side inside out. So Tesla invented the AC power system, and Edison wanted the DC power system, and the AC power system worked. But Edison said at the time, when they came up with how to charge for it, let's have a unit price of electricity and a standing charge, which if you look at your bills today around the world, it's still a unit price of electricity and a standing charge. And there's some really important implied assumptions with that, which I'll come to, is Thomas Edison said, I'm selling light and next year I'll have a more efficient light bulb. Now think about it. He was getting $100,000 for selling light in New York. And next year, because he'd have an electric light bulb twice as efficient, he would only get $50,000. Now, to any businessman, that should be just madness. Yet that's exactly the madness that is in the energy market. And ultimately where it comes back to is people don't want energy. When you make that assumption, what you're assuming, energy consumption is a good proxy for the utility of the consumer. A much better proxy for the utility of the consumer is utility, which is energy with a reliable, resilient power system that they don't have to worry anything about. And while we retain energy markets on the competitive aspect of energy markets, and not concerned in energy markets for resilience, then we will get suboptimal or inefficient or bad outcomes. And when you throw in renewables on it, that matters. I can argue why it worked without renewables. But so I'm basically saying is, to Eckhart's question, yes, I think a fundamental rethink of energy markets and resilience markets is important. But should it be on a competitive basis? The third question down for Guy Nicholson, I'm saying, actually, I believe the resilience is a public good in economic terms. And so the blatant use of supply and demand economics is not appropriate for that. And you need to really think about how you do it. So I would be happy to say, yes, if you have a market that does both of them, but not necessarily competition being supply and demand and neoliberal economics. No, not necessarily for the resilience aspect, because that's in economic terms a public good. If you get those principles right, I think you can drive the investment needed to solve the technical challenges. But to answer Eckhart's question, yes, the policymakers and the regulators need to fundamentally look at their designs. The policymakers should be saying, this is what I want, which is keep a resilient power system and get affordable energy, whether it's renewable or not, and it's renewable. And the regulators need to be informed about the designs that solve the technical challenges that the TSOs are now facing. But the TSOs also need to be copped on to explain it in a way that the policymakers and regulators can understand, and we can have a discussion about that too.
Thanks, Jono. And for all of you, in case you're wondering when Jono is referring to the third question, so again, on slido.com, you can see all the questions that are coming in, and you can also vote them up and down. So actually, our second most popular question directed at Luke, and it's also Guy from StatCraft asking, do you think that grid forming converters will make your investments in synchronous compensators redundant?
I don't think so. I mean, there's no one solution to address the requirements of the transforming system, and it depends on specific capabilities of grid forming inverters as well. You know, we need to be very clear and increasingly clear. Are we talking about advanced inverters that are capable of performing well under low fault level conditions, or are we talking about grid forming inverters that can provide a reference to a gigawatt system and provide fault current for protection to operate as designed, or do we need to look at the redesign of protection and other things? Again, no one solution. I think synchronous condensers, grid forming batteries, other grid investments to address some of the other limitations that are inherent to a system that was designed and planned around synchronous resources but is changing is very critical, and really an active question that's part of the IBR research team under the GPST.
Thanks, Luke. We have another question here coming in, and I'm going to pose it to Julia. It was initially posed to Julia and Jonathan. Could you please elaborate further on the type of studies to define critical inertia?
Yeah, so these were regular dynamic studies that probably every system operator runs. We just came up with scenarios for various inertia conditions. And in each scenario, we trip a generator, which is our largest, two largest nuclear units. We trip this and we monitor frequency so that it doesn't touch the first step of under frequency load shedding. So we talked about load shed, and it's set at certain frequency level to, you know, to start load shed, and we don't want to do that. And so in a study, we look at amount of inertia and amount of reserves that we need to trip to largest nuclear units and not go into under frequency load shed. And we determine lowest amount of inertia that we can live with, and the rest will be provided by frequency response by various resources. And then from that level on, we increase inertia and look at how much reserve we need in every case. I hope this helps. And we used PSSC TSAT tools for that to do different studies. So like PSSC or TSAT can be used, it doesn't matter.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to jump a little bit further down, and I'm going to be curious who wants to answer this. So how much will it cost to get power systems to accommodate 100% renewables? For instance, by how much in terms of percentage will it increase the consumer bills? Any takers for this question?
Jono, I'll take that if you want. Actually, funny enough, we've done some analysis. I haven't actually released it yet, but I've gone out to 2030 and looking at 100% and looking at the costs and looking at business as usual and market designs across capacity markets, energy markets, renewable supports, inefficiencies in dispatch, a range of things, system services, investments. And if you do it with what is current logic, the transition will be about 50 billion over 10 years for ourselves. If you do it with the right designs and the principles that I alluded to earlier on, you can get that down to, say, about 45 billion. But then when you look at the unit price of electricity, that still is about a 15 to 20% increase on the electricity consumers. But if you get demand side participation giving you large scale services that you need, such as faster frequency, congestion management, and potentially other things, and there's a value in that, which basically we have in that redesign market, and say they capture half of that value, actually you end up with a net reduced cost to consumers in the Ireland case. So what I'm basically saying is, if we apply classic traditional thought process and economics to the solutions, we will fail to deliver what we have to deliver, which is an affordable transition, a secure transition, and a renewable transition. But if we actually take ourselves, and I unfortunately, I will agree with Gav that the TSOs are conservative, and I'm saying actually they're paid to be prudent, not conservative, and it's a fundamentally different standard. And I certainly hold dear to myself a prudency. As long as we're prudent and manage the transition, and as long as the regulators and the policymakers give you unambiguous supports, and the regulators come up with the designs. Now, I'm trying to help the regulators coming up with designs, which is hugely difficult because they sort of say, well, it's not your job. And I say, yeah, but it's not solving the issues that we have, so let's help you out. But I think that's the cost. I think you can do it at a cost neutral going forward, but not the way we're doing demand side at the moment around the world. Notwithstanding it, Julia, ERCAT is a good thing.
Donna, thanks for that. And I'm gonna ask one question came in from Charlie Smith, and I'm gonna direct it at Gav. Can you, so initially Donna mentioned the, hang on, this just jumped around. A general question stimulated by Jonathan's opening comments. How influential are system operators with policymakers and vice versa?
And we're not recording this.
Yeah, a tricky one. I think we've heard right now, sometimes the policymakers need the assistance of the system operators. I think in my experience, what I have found is regulators and policymakers have a lot of regard for what the system operator has to say. I think they understand our role to the extent that they don't really want to go against what the system operator is saying. And again, that puts a tremendous responsibility on the system operator not to be conservative and not to want to move forward. On the other hand, I think that system operators do need to be moved, and they need to be accommodating. So there should be a partnership, and I think influential, yes, in some countries more influential than others. But I think if you get to a point where there's a adversarial relationship between the policymakers, the regulators, and the system operators, I think that's a recipe for disaster. My politically correct answer would be, I think that relationship really should be worked on. It's not where it should be.
Gav, thank you. And I know we're kind of coming towards the end of our session. So my last question to each one of our speakers, what is the one thing in one sentence that you want our audience to take away from today? And I'm going to start with Gav because you're the closest to me on the screen.
I think for me, it's really just to get the message out there to other developing countries, people who haven't really started on this journey yet. There's a lot of help. There are a lot of people out there who can take you by the hand and lead you down this path and take advantage of it. There's a tremendous amount to be learned, and it's not as scary as you might think.
And Luke, you're up next on the screen.
I'd say definitely a shared desire to effectively manage the transition collaboratively together would be a great takeaway for our audience today.
Awesome. And Julia?
Yeah, so one I have two. One I wanted to mention is that, the sky is not falling. I feel like we can, get to 100% penetration with time and technology being there and applying all these good solutions that Jonna is talking about. And one thing I wanted to say towards GPST is like we really benefited from collaboration we started collaborating closer with FSOs and then with other system operators. And I think that's the key of sharing experiences and, getting to higher and higher percentages of penetration.
Awesome. And Jono, one sentence.
I think it's all achievable. It's all achievable, and it's achievable in a very fast time frame. But you have to collectively, in my view, get out of traditional thinking in power systems. We need.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And then I think on this note, and as Mark said earlier, like all the other questions will be addressed at a later point. So from my end, it's going to be just a really big thank you to all of our speakers for joining us from around the world, and also to the GPST team for setting up the event, especially to April Alderdice, who has been really instrumental in setting up this event. You can see her on the screen on top right now, ideally. And so thanks again. And on this note, I'm going to pass it on back on to Stina.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting the event for all of Global GPST. I think it has been a valuable insight that you have all shared. And it's not only insight on what you actually need and what challenges you see, but also sharing what you are actually learning right now and what we can all gain of knowledge from each other. One of the sentences I took with me was actually one that was said that we have to go get ahead of the problem and also get ahead of what we need to do and what we need to invest in. But at the same time, I took from the different discussions and interviews that it's also a matter of looking at the challenges we have in a slightly different way that we're used to. We have to address it in another way, because when we do that, we are actually able to see new types of solutions, also see new ways that participants in the electricity sector can actually contribute, rather than look at all of them as someone who is introducing problems and challenges. So by kind of tipping it all around and looking at it in a different way, we can reach some of the targets that we actually set doing together. So from my point of view, I'm glad that you're all passing on learnings in order to help us all keeping up or increasing the pace of integrating renewables. And I'm especially glad to hear you all saying that you think it's possible to get 100% renewable energy. And I think that's the note that we have to pass on to the work on the COP26 that comes ahead of us. And then thank you all for joining us today. And I hope you'll pass on the same message to people you talk to as well.